Go away. You are not invited." My son-in-law shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. He must have forgotten he was standing in my house. I did not yell back. I did not plead. There was no raised voice from me, only a smile. Slow, icy, deliberate. I pushed back my chair, crossed to the front door, and did what no one sitting at that table ever expected. "My name is Wallace Crane. Welcome to Alphadad Stories. I'm glad you found your way here. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along, because there are more where this came from." Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, is it morning, where you are, afternoon, or late at night? I always find it interesting to know what part of the day someone chooses to sit with a story like this. A quick note before we continue: some details in this story have been shaped for dramatic effect, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. It's the truth underneath the story that matters most. Now let me tell you how a proud father, a man who spent his whole life constructing a legacy, became a stranger in his own home, and how I made sure they never forgot the lesson I handed them. It was Christmas Eve. Outside, heavy snow was burying Buckhead, Georgia, coating the manicured lawns and grand estates in a silent frozen white. Inside my house, the fireplaces snapped and popped, and the scent of roasted prime rib, fresh thyme, and expensive wine moved through every room. A perfect holiday tableau, the kind they put on luxury greeting cards. But underneath that immaculate surface, the foundation of my family had gone completely rotten. My entire career had been built as a structural engineer. 40 years of scrutinizing massive steel beams, calculating the load-bearing limits of concrete pillars, identifying the hidden stress points that could bring a towering structure to the ground. I was professionally trained to see catastrophe coming before anyone else. Yet inside my own family, I had been utterly blind to every crack. I stood before the mirror in my downstairs bedroom, straightening the deep navy silk tie that my late wife Gloria had bought me for our 30th anniversary. Gloria had been gone 2 years by then. When she left this world, the warmth drained out of this house, along with her. We had purchased this sprawling $2.5 million estate 30 years prior. I cleared the mortgage a full decade early through sweat, long hours, and sacrifices most men wouldn't make. It was my castle, the sanctuary where I intended to spend my final years in absolute peace. I smoothed down the lapels of my finest dark pewter suit, drew a slow breath, and stepped out of my room toward the main dining area to join my family for the holiday meal. As I crossed into the grand dining room, I stopped cold. There, anchoring the center of the space, sat the massive oak table that Gloria and I had commissioned from a local craftsman decades ago. A beautiful, heavy piece of woodwork, solid and uncompromising. But when my eyes landed on the placed settings, a cold knot tightened deep in my gut. The table had been done up elaborately. Brass candelabras, fresh cedar centerpieces, and expensive bone china plates, arranged with surgical precision. And right away, I noticed the count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 plates. 8 perfectly folded linen napkins. 8 crystal wine glasses throwing back the chandelier light. I scanned the room. My son-in-law Brendan Hurst, 34 years old, wearing a tailored suit that ran more than a decent used car, was pouring champagne. My daughter Lydia, 32, the only child Gloria and I ever raised, was nervously straightening the silverware. Brendan's parents were settled on the far side of the table, sipping their drinks, with the air of people who've never earned anything they have. And then there were the guests. 4 men I had never laid eyes on, sharp, expensive suits, hair slicked back, eyes cold and calculating. Not the look of friends, the look of predators. I counted again. Brendan, Lydia, Brendan's parents, and the 4 strangers. 8 people. 8 chairs pulled up tight to that table. No place setting for me. No chair for me. I stood in the doorway staring at the polished oak surface while something hollow and crushing washed through me. How had I become invisible in my own house? I thought of the late nights hunched over blueprints, the weekends I gave up my daughter's school, plays, her recitals, all to bank enough to secure her future. I thought of signing the check that paid this house off in full. I had handed Lydia everything. And when Brendan arrived with his smooth talk and his supposedly brilliant startup, I pulled him in with open arms. After Gloria died, the house had turned painfully quiet. Lydia and Brendan came to me with what sounded like a loving offer. They wanted to move in. They said they'd look after me as I aged, keep me from being alone, all while they built up capital for Brendan's growing business. I was grieving, exposed, and hungry for family around me, so I said yes. I had opened my own gates and waved the Trojan horse straight through. Over the following 8 months, I was slowly and deliberately pushed to the edges of my own existence. It began with small asks, minor concessions I accepted to keep the peace. First, they claimed my library. Then they moved me down to the basement. But standing in that dining room, staring at a table where my name had been erased from the guest list on Christmas Eve, the truth finally broke through every layer of denial I had left. I was not a respected patriarch in this house. I was a nuisance. The fury rose in my chest, hot, blinding, total. But my engineer's mind asserted itself. Rage makes you sloppy. Composure makes you lethal. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand to know why I'd been cut out. Instead, I turned around, walked quietly down the hall to my private study, and took hold of my heavy, leather-backed reading chair. I gripped the armrests and dragged it out through the study door and straight down the corridor. The thick wooden legs scraped hard against the pristine hardwood floors, sending a long, grinding screech bouncing off every wall in the house. The polite, hollow chatter in the dining room went dead immediately. I hauled that chair directly to the head of the table, the very spot where I had sat for 30 years. I forced it in between Brendan and one of his slick-suited guests. Then I crossed to the antique buffet cabinet, lifted out a spare ceramic plate and a silver fork, and set them down in front of my chair. And I sat. I looked around that table, holding the gaze of every person in the room, my expression giving away nothing. The silence that fell was absolute, dense enough to press against your skin. The 4 strangers traded confused, irritated looks. Brendan's parents stared at me with undisguised contempt, as though a vagrant had wandered in off the street and planted himself at their royal banquet. And Lydia, my daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders and shielded from every hard thing the world had to offer. She looked into her lap, her face burning red, unable to lift her eyes to mine. Too cowardly to defend the father who had put the very floor beneath her feet. Brendan's face went a violent shade of crimson. The vein along his neck pulsed against his stiff white collar. He shoved back from his seat so hard the chair cracked against the wall. He drove his fist down onto the oak table. Silverware jumped. Crystal glasses rang against each other. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Brendan hissed, leaning across the table, eyes burning with fury. "Go away! You are not invited to this dinner." Screaming at me. Inside the house I owned over the table I paid for. I did not flinch. I did not lift my voice. I looked straight into his red, furious face and I smiled. Slow, deliberate. Enough to make the rage behind his eyes stutter into something closer to unease. I set my silver fork down quietly on the empty plate in front of me. I rose, smoothing the front of my dark pewter suit. "Enjoy your dinner, Brendan." The words came out soft and perfectly level. I turned my back on all of them and walked at an easy pace toward the front foyer. Behind me, I could hear Brendan muttering to his guests about his crazy, senile father-in-law. Every one of them believed I was retreating, that I had been beaten down, humiliated, and broken, that I was walking out into the freezing snow to swallow my shame somewhere private. But as my hand closed around the cold brass doorknob, a quiet certainty settled over me like armor. They had no idea, not the faintest notion of what was coming next, because I wasn't walking away. I was opening the door for the people standing on the other side of it. To understand how I ended up at my own front door that night, you have to go back 8 months to the precise moment everything unraveled, the moment my world was torn open, and my judgment was swallowed by a grief so heavy it felt like trying to breathe underwater. Gloria passed in early April. The cancer was aggressive, merciless, and fast. 1 month she was out back, pressing hydrangeas into the garden soil, hands dark with earth, laughing at something I called from the patio. 2 months later, I stood in a black suit, watching a wooden casket sink into the wet ground. Without her, that $2.5 million estate felt like an enormous, echoing mausoleum. I am a man who lives by logic and numbers. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer. I understood the exact tolerances of concrete and steel, and I built my career on ensuring that every structure I touched could hold against whatever came. People trusted me to keep their buildings standing tall and secure. Yet in my own life, the sudden removal of my load-bearing pillar left me completely unstable. I was a 70-year-old man drifting through echoing hallways, eating meals in silence, sleeping on a single side of a king-sized bed. I was vulnerable, and a vulnerable man is always the easiest target in the room. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, barely 3 weeks after Gloria's funeral, when Lydia and Brendan came over. We settled in the living room. Lydia's eyes moved slowly around the space, lingering on the empty corners where her mother's presence had once been so commanding. Brendan sat beside her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, wearing that earnest expression he always put on when he was about to make a pitch. "Dad, we've been talking," Lydia began, her voice low and wrapped in concern. "We hate thinking of you here all alone. Mom wouldn't have wanted you rattling around in this massive house by yourself. It's too much for one person." I looked down at my coffee cup and sighed. "I'm managing, Lydia. It's just quiet, that's all." Brendan reached over and laid his hand gently over Lydia's, the picture-perfect image of the devoted, caring husband. "Wallace, we want to help. My tech startup is hitting a critical expansion phase right now. We need to redirect a significant portion of our personal capital into the business over the next year or two. At the same time, we've both been genuinely worried about you, about the isolation, about what this silence is doing to your health. We were thinking of letting go of the lease on our downtown apartment and moving in here with you. It's a win-win. I get the capital I need for the company's growth, and more importantly, we get to be here to actually look after you." It was a plausible lie, polished, reasonable, compassionate sounding. They were framing it as a sacrifice of their independence for the sake of a grieving widower, while quietly asking for my blessing to bankroll their future. I should have seen the hidden cracks. I should have held Brendan's proposal up to the same hard scrutiny I applied to my engineering blueprints. But I was blinded by a raw, desperate need for family. Lydia was the only living piece of Gloria I had left. I wanted to hear footsteps on the wooden stairs again. I wanted the smell of food coming from the kitchen. I wanted the comforting illusion that this house still held a whole family inside it. So I looked past the fundamental flaws in Brendan's character. I looked past the quiet, troubling way Lydia always seemed to fold into herself whenever Brendan took command of a conversation. I wanted to believe the best in my daughter, and by extension, the man she had chosen. "You're welcome to stay," I told them, my voice heavy. "This house has more than enough room for all of us. Don't worry about rent or utility bills. Focus on your business, Brendan. And Lydia, just be here with me." They moved their belongings in exactly 3 days later. The invasion started almost at once, dressed up neatly under the banner of domestic helpfulness. Boxes appeared, furniture was shifted around, and the quiet rhythm I had built my days around was suddenly overridden by Brendan's erratic schedule. He was a shade too eager, directing the professional movers, barking instructions with the loud authority of a newly crowned king taking possession of conquered land. I pushed the feeling down. I told myself it was just an adjustment period. I told myself I was a stubborn old man who needed to learn how to share his space again. But the illusion of a harmonious household didn't survive even a full 24 hours. It was their very first night under my roof. I had gone out for my usual evening walk through the neighborhood, a routine I kept faithfully to maintain my joints and clear my head. The cool night air felt good against my face. It gave me a flicker of hope. I let myself imagine the breakfast we'd share the next morning, the ease of having people to talk to over the newspaper. I came back to the house just after 9 p.m. I walked up the paved driveway, stepped onto the front porch, and drew my brass keys from my coat pocket. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped into the foyer. The house was very still. I reached toward the security panel on the wall, exactly as I had every night for the past 15 years, and entered my 4-digit code to disarm the system. The keypad flashed a hard red. A sharp electronic tone rang through the hallway. "Error. Invalid code." I frowned. My hands were old, but my memory was precise. I entered the code a second time carefully. Red flash, sharp beep, invalid code. Something uneasy moved through my chest. The alarm had never once misfired before. I tried a third time, pressing each digit deliberately. The system locked me out entirely, and a loud warning tone began to sound 60 seconds before the police would be dispatched. Then Brendan appeared at the top of the sweeping staircase. He was wearing linen pajamas, holding a glass of still mineral water, looking entirely too relaxed. "Brendan," I called out over the blaring alarm. "The security panel isn't working. My code won't go through." He came down the stairs at an easy, unhurried pace, that casual smile on his face. He didn't carry himself like a guest who had just moved in. He moved like an owner dealing with a confused tenant. He walked past me, reached to the panel, and keyed in a completely different set of numbers. The alarm cut off immediately. The green light blinked back on. I stared at the panel, then at him. "What did you just do? Why didn't my code work?" Brendan lifted his glass and took a slow sip, his eyes holding mine with a maddening calm. "Oh, I'm sorry, Wallace. I meant to tell you. The system threw some kind of security glitch this afternoon while you were out. It was acting up and driving Lydia crazy, so I went ahead and reset the master code to clear the issue. I just synced it to the code we used at the old apartment." He gave me that practiced, perfectly reasonable smile. "I'll write the new numbers down for you in the morning," he added, already turning away toward the kitchen. "Sleep well, Wallace." I stood alone in the dim foyer, staring at the green light on the wall. A security glitch. It was such a small, tidy explanation. But my gut turned over hard. You don't reset the master security code in another man's house on your first night living there unless you are making a point. He had locked me out of my own system, and he had done it right to my face. I stood there floored by his audacity, understanding with awful clarity that I had made a grave mistake. I had brought a parasite into my sanctuary. The man my daughter married didn't see a grieving father who needed company. He saw a naive, helpless obstacle between himself and everything he wanted. I drew a long, slow breath and felt the coldness of the air settle in my chest. The blinking green light on that panel felt like a taunt. I stayed in the silent foyer for a long while after Brendan walked away. I told myself to be patient. I told myself Brendan was simply an arrogant young man with no sense of limits or decency. I tried to persuade myself that Lydia would step in and correct it, but the foundation beneath my life in this house had already begun shifting in ways I could no longer pretend away. Over the following weeks, the subtle indignities compounded rapidly into a deliberate, methodical takeover. It was a masterclass in slow eviction. Brendan didn't seize the house through confrontation or force. He spread through it the way black mold moves behind drywall, silent and visible, until the rot has reached every corner. The first real casualty of this quiet war was my library. For more than 3 decades, that room had been my truest sanctuary. A grand space, its walls lined floor to vaulted ceiling with dark, custom walnut shelving. Those shelves carried hundreds of architectural volumes, structural engineering manuals, and original blueprints from projects I had devoted my life to building. On the walls hung my framed degrees, engineering licenses, and the lifetime achievement awards I'd earned through decades of unrelenting work. Gloria used to settle into the plush leather armchair beside the large bay window, reading her romance novels in quiet companionship, while I drafted technical designs at my heavy oak desk. One Tuesday afternoon, I came back from picking up groceries at the local market. The house was unusually loud. I made my way down the main hallway toward the kitchen to put away the fresh produce. As I passed the library, I pulled up short. The heavy double doors had been propped wide open. Inside, 2 men in gray work uniforms were methodically dismantling my life. My solid oak desk had been shoved without ceremony into the far corner of the room. In its place stood a sleek glass table fitted with dual monitors and a thick tangle of black cables. My heart slammed in my chest. I dropped the grocery bags on the hardwood floor and stepped carefully into the room. There, stacked carelessly against the freshly painted wall, sat a dozen cheap cardboard moving boxes. Jutting from the top of one crushed box was the delicate glass plaque I had received for designing the Harmon Avenue overpass. It was badly chipped along the top corner. Brendan was stationed by the window, barking into his mobile phone, waving his free hand with that artificial high-energy charisma he saved for business calls. He noticed me frozen in the doorway, raised a single finger to silence me, and finished his conversation at his own pace. When he finally ended the call, he swung around to face me with a wide, hollow smile. "Wallace, good, you're finally home," Brendan said brightly, riding right over the shock plainly visible on my face. "Sorry for the mess. My startup has entered a serious hypergrowth phase, and I need a proper, dedicated workspace. The investors expect a professional background on video calls. A real corporate setup is essential for our branding right now." I stood staring at the cardboard boxes holding 40 years of my professional life. "You packed up my engineering awards. You took down my framed blueprints without a word to me. This is my private library, Brendan." He let out a short, dismissive exhale, visibly irritated that I wasn't falling in line with his grand vision. "Wallace, let's be practical for a moment. You're retired. You don't draft blueprints anymore. You sit in here and read. The company needs this space to generate real revenue. We're a family now, and family means making practical compromises." He walked straight past me, dropping a patronizing hand on my shoulder as he moved toward the kitchen. I felt my hands curl into tight, trembling fists. The audacity of it was staggering. I went directly to find Lydia. I found her tucked into the sunroom, curled up on the floral sofa, scrolling idly on her tablet. I stood before her, working hard to keep my voice level. Lydia, your husband just packed my entire library into cardboard boxes. He took over my space without the basic decency to ask permission. You need to speak to him about this right now. What he did is completely unacceptable. Lydia didn't look up immediately. When she finally raised her eyes, the expression waiting for me was already carefully rehearsed, a plausible lie layered thick with manufactured filial concern. Dad, please don't make this difficult. She spoke in the calm, measured tone one might use to soothe a confused and unreasonable child. Brendan is under enormous pressure with the business launch. He needs a quiet, professional place to work without interruptions. He can use the spare guest bedroom upstairs, I said, my frustration rising. The library is my private space. It holds my entire career. Lydia rose slowly from the sofa and placed her hands gently on my arms. Dad, we actually wanted to talk to you about the bedroom situation anyway. Brendan and I have been thinking about your living arrangements. We've noticed you struggling lately. Your knees have gotten really bad. I saw you wincing on the main stairs just last week. My knees were perfectly fine. I walked 2 miles every single evening without a wince or a complaint. I looked at my daughter in silence, waiting for the rest of it. We think it would really be best if you moved down to the basement guest suite. Lydia continued, her eyes wide with theatrical concern. There are no stairs to manage from the garage entrance. It's completely safe. You'll have your own private bathroom. You'll have so much more peace and quiet down there away from Brendan's business calls. We just worry so much about you falling and getting hurt while we're in the middle of working. The betrayal hit me like something solid and heavy to the chest. She was using my age as a weapon against me. She was dressing up my forced removal from the main floors of my own home as an act of loving care. The basement guest suite was little more than a glorified storage room. A single narrow window let in barely any light. It was perpetually damp, consistently cold, and cut off entirely from the rest of the house. You want to put me in the basement? I said flatly. The words tasted like ash. It's a private suite, Dad, she corrected quickly, stepping back as though my tone unsettled her. It's for your own good. We just want you comfortable and safe. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I looked at my daughter, the little girl I had steadied on her first bicycle in our driveway, the young woman whose college tuition I had paid in full without a second thought. She was standing in the house I had built with my own labor and sacrifice, calmly telling me to go below ground so her arrogant husband could run his business from my sanctuary. I didn't argue. Arguing with a practiced liar only gives them room to manufacture more lies. I simply turned and walked away and began the slow, grinding heartbreak of packing my things. Moving my life into the basement took 3 long, exhausting days. Every trip down those creaking wooden stairs felt like another step deeper into permanent exile. I arranged my clothes in the small, musty closet. I positioned a reading lamp beside the narrow, firm bed. The quiet down there was a different kind of quiet, oppressive, heavy, the silence of a man the world above has stopped noticing. I could hear their footsteps crossing the hardwood floors overhead, a steady reminder that life was carrying on without me. I tried to draw some comfort from the thought that I was helping my daughter. I turned her words over in my head again and again. She said it was for my safety. She said they cared about my well-being. I wanted to believe the plausible lie. I wanted to hold on to the idea that this was a temporary sacrifice for the sake of family harmony. But that fragile idea was torn apart late that very same night. It was well past midnight. I lay rigid in the basement bed, staring up at the low ceiling, listening to the steady drone of the furnace. The house above was dark and still. Then a heavy, dragging, scraping sound came crashing through the floorboards directly above me. It was coming from the master bedroom, the room that had been mine and Gloria's for 30 years. The sound was loud, rough, and unmistakable. the sound of heavy furniture being forced across polished hardwood. I threw back the covers, my heart hammering. I laced up my walking shoes and crept silently up the dark basement stairs. I eased the door open just enough to see into the main hallway. The heavy front door stood propped wide open, a biting gust of frozen air pouring through. Brendan was struggling to maneuver an enormous heavy piece of furniture out the door, shoving it awkwardly toward the edge of the paved driveway, where a large rented dumpster had been sitting since that afternoon. The pale moonlight caught the intricate hand-carved floral patterns in the dark wood. It was Gloria's antique vanity, the vanity where my wife had sat every morning to brush her hair. The piece she had treasured above almost everything else, a priceless heirloom handed down from her grandmother. I had specifically asked Lydia to keep it safe in the master bedroom because of how much it meant to me. Brendan put his shoulder into it hard. The vanity tipped over the edge of the porch and crashed down the concrete front steps. I heard the sharp, sickening crack of antique wood splitting against the frozen driveway. He dragged the broken pieces across the wet pavement and tossed them without a second thought into the rusted metal dumpster. He wiped his hands on his expensive trousers, pulled out his phone, and typed a quick message entirely unmoved by the fact that he had just casually destroyed a priceless piece of my late wife's history. I stood motionless in the shadow of the stairwell, my breath caught tight in my throat. This was not about reclaiming practical space. This was not about my knees or my physical safety. This was a systematic, deliberate erasure of my existence from this property. They weren't simply taking over my house. They were pitching my entire life into the garbage. The morning after the vanity was destroyed, I did not go looking for Brendan. I sat at the small table in my basement suite, drinking black coffee, and I applied the discipline of a structural engineer to my circumstances. A massive concrete foundation never fractures without sustained enormous pressure. Buildings don't simply fall down overnight. The cracks always come first. Hairline invisible buildings slowly. Brendan was applying that kind of pressure to my life, steadily isolating me and scrubbing my presence from the main floors. What was the structural motive? The sheer aggression behind hurling Gloria's antique vanity into a dumpster spoke of a man who already felt complete ownership. He was moving through this house like a man who had already signed the deed. I needed to locate the hidden stress point. I needed to understand what was truly driving his behavior. So I stopped being a grieving, accommodating father and became a quiet, watchful observer inside my own home. I studied Brendan carefully over the following 2 weeks, looking for anything irregular in his daily patterns. An obvious anomaly surfaced quickly. Brendan claimed to be running a thriving technology startup. He spent long hours sealed inside my former library, talking loudly on conference calls. Yet for a man supposedly consumed by the digital world, he had developed a peculiar, almost obsessive fixation with the physical mail. Our postal carrier, Gerald, typically arrived around 11 in the morning. For 15 years, the mail had simply dropped through the brass slot in the front door. But now Brendan was intercepting it. Every morning, precisely at 10:50, he walked out to the front porch with a coffee in hand. He stood there waiting until Gerald appeared. Brendan collected the stack of envelopes directly from Gerald's hands, exchanged a few pleasant words, and immediately disappeared back inside. He then shut himself in the library for an hour. When the sorted mail eventually appeared on the kitchen counter for Lydia and me, it consisted entirely of grocery circulars, restaurant coupons, and utility bills. Never anything of substance. Why would a supposedly wealthy, successful technology entrepreneur plant himself by the front door like a starving dog waiting for scraps every single morning without fail? What was arriving by physical mail that he absolutely had to seize before anyone else in the house could open it? The opportunity to find out came on a freezing Tuesday afternoon. Lydia and Brendan announced they were heading into downtown Atlanta for a lunch meeting with prospective investors. They dressed in their sharpest clothes, kissed me on the cheek with counterfeit warmth, and drove away. The moment their taillights disappeared around the corner, I moved. I climbed the basement stairs and went straight to the attached garage. I passed the regular trash cans and went directly to the large blue recycling bin pushed into the far corner. Brendan was careful about his image, but arrogant men grow careless when they're certain no one is watching. He had installed a heavy-duty paper shredder in his new office to protect sensitive documents, but he emptied the shredder bin straight into our unlined household recycling container. I lifted the heavy blue lid. Inside was a dense mountain of white paper strips, a tangled, chaotic wreckage of destroyed information. I plunged both hands in, scooping out large armfuls of shredded material, and loaded them into a large plastic garbage bag. I carried the bag back down to the damp isolation of my basement suite. I spread the strips out across my bed and switched on the reading lamp. It looked like an impossible puzzle, thousands of jagged paper fragments randomly intermingled. But I had spent 4 decades working through extraordinarily complex structural calculations for skyscrapers and bridges. I had the patience of a desperate man who understood that his survival depended on uncovering the truth. I began sorting the strips by paperweight and texture. The bulk of it was standard thin printer stock, discarded drafts of meaningless business correspondence most likely. But after 30 minutes of careful sorting, my fingers found something different. Thicker paper, heavier, a distinct glossy surface, high-quality corporate stationery. I gathered every glossy strip into a separate pile and pushed the rest onto the floor. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my back stiff from the cold and damp, and began fitting the jagged fragments together. It was slow grinding work. A curved letter here, a straight blue line there. After an hour, I had assembled the upper left corner of the document. My breath caught hard. The pieced-together fragments revealed the unmistakable corporate logo of the largest national bank in the country. The same bank where Gloria and I had held our joint checking accounts for over 30 years. The same bank that had once held the mortgage documents on this very house. My heart hammered against my ribs. I grabbed a roll of clear adhesive tape from the nightstand and worked faster fingers moving with urgent precision. I found a strip containing a date. It had been sent just 4 days earlier. Then I found the most critical piece. A long strip holding the official recipient address block. I smoothed it down carefully. The name printed in bold black ink was not Brendan Hurst. It was not Lydia Crane. The letter was addressed explicitly to me, Wallace Crane. Brendan had been deliberately intercepting my personal financial mail, running it through the shredder in his office and burying the evidence in the garage recycling bin. The brazenness of it made my blood go cold. I had received no correspondence from that particular bank branch in years, not since the letter confirming my mortgage had been paid off in full. I combed through the remaining glossy strips on the bedspread, piecing together the body of the letter. The text was broken keywords missing where the shredder blades had done their work, but there was enough to grasp the full horror of what I was looking at. I taped down a fragment that read equity line. Another read appraised property value. Then I found the center paragraph and pressed the tape down carefully over the jagged edges. I read the reconstructed sentence aloud in the silence of my basement, the words landing in the still air like a verdict. Congratulations, Wallace. You have been fully approved for your requested home equity line of credit in the amount of $1.5 million, sir. I sat without moving, staring at the taped paper, until my vision lost its edges. I had not applied for any loan. I had not asked a single financial institution for a single dime. But my name was on the approval notice. I sat in the dim light of the basement, my breathing gone shallow and tight. The foundation of my life had not merely cracked. It had been packed with hidden explosives, and the fuse was already burning. A line of credit for $1.5 million, drawn entirely against the equity of a house I owned free and clear. To pull off a financial move of that scale required deliberate systemic fraud, forged signatures, fabricated identity verification. Brendan was not simply an arrogant houseguest. He was an active predator using my own daughter as his willing partner. I gathered the taped fragments of the bank letter, carefully folded them into a small packet, and tucked them beneath the insoles of my winter boots. If he had been bold enough to forge my signature on a loan of that size, what else had he already taken? My mind ran quickly through my remaining assets. My pension accounts were intact. My vehicles were paid off. But there was something else, something worth far more than any cash account. I waited until the following morning. Brendan announced he had a networking lunch downtown and would be away for several hours. Lydia was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone. I told her I was going upstairs to the den to track down an old tax document. The den was on the second floor, a small room Brendan had dismissed as too cramped for his corporate purposes. I closed the door quietly behind me and crossed to a framed landscape painting on the far wall. I swung the wooden frame outward on its hidden hinges, exposing the digital keypad of my personal wall safe. I entered the 6-digit code. The heavy steel door gave a click and swung open. I withdrew my passport, emergency cash, and the old insurance policies. Everything appeared perfectly undisturbed. Then my hand reached to the very back of the compartment and closed around the small, dark blue velvet box. A cold chill moved through me before I'd even touched the clasp. The box was wrong, far too light. I pressed the golden clasp, and the lid fell back. The velvet interior was bare. Gloria's 2-carat diamond anniversary necklace was gone. A flawless pendant I had spent 3 years saving to buy for our 30th wedding anniversary. She had worn it every single day. The afternoon she passed, I had placed it in that safe myself. I couldn't stand seeing it sitting on her empty dresser. Its financial worth ran easily to $30,000, but no dollar figure could touch its sentimental value. It was the physical embodiment of everything I felt for my wife, and someone had taken it. I squeezed that empty blue box until my knuckles went white. My hands shook with a blinding, ferocious rage. I left the safe hanging open and moved straight down the hallway and down the grand staircase, my heavy footsteps ringing hard against the hardwood. I went directly into the kitchen. Lydia was pouring herself a cup of coffee, humming softly. I brought the empty velvet box down onto the granite countertop with a sharp crack that made her jump. Hot coffee sloshed over the rim and splashed across her pristine white sweater. She gasped and spun to face me. "Dad, what on earth is wrong with you?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Where is your mother's diamond necklace, Lydia?" I asked, my voice dangerously low and level. Lydia went still. The color drained from her face in an instant, leaving her looking pale and hollowed out. Her eyes moved frantically around the kitchen landing, anywhere but on me. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, dropping to a nervous whisper. That safe was locked. I continued, taking one slow step toward her. "The only people who know the combination to that safe are me, your late mother, and you. I checked it just now. The box is empty." "Where is the necklace?" Small beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. She backed up, gripping the edge of the kitchen island. "Dad, I swear I haven't touched it. You must have moved it somewhere and forgotten. Don't lie to me in my own house." The fury that had been pressing behind my composed exterior finally broke through. "That necklace has not moved from that safe in 2 years." Before she could put together another pitiful excuse, the heavy oak front door swung open, and Brendan strolled into the kitchen, pulling off his expensive wool coat. He felt the tension the moment he walked in. His eyes moved from my face to the empty velvet box on the counter, then to his wife. He did not look surprised. He looked annoyed. "What is going on here?" Brendan asked, positioning himself smoothly between me and Lydia. He folded his arms across his chest, planting himself in a deliberately dominant stance. "The diamond anniversary necklace I gave Gloria is missing from my personal wall safe," I told him, holding my ground. "And Lydia is the only other living person who has the access code." Brendan exhaled a long, theatrical sigh. He uncrossed his arms and turned to me with an expression of deep, patronizing pity. It was a performance fit for the stage. "Come on, old man," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Listen to what you're saying. You're standing here aggressively accusing your own daughter of stealing a piece of jewelry you almost certainly misplaced yourself." "I did not misplace anything," I said flatly. Brendan moved closer, dropping his voice to a register that was soothing and deeply insulting at the same time. "Wallace, let's be honest with each other. The weight of living alone in this big house, grieving the loss of Gloria, it's taken a serious toll on you. Your memory has been slipping. You've been struggling lately. Don't you remember the conversation we had last month? You told me you were concerned about keeping valuables in a simple wall safe. You said you'd moved the diamond necklace to your safety deposit box at the downtown bank branch for better security." I stood there and let the sheer audacity of the lie wash over me. He was trying to rewrite my own reality right to my face. He was running a calculated campaign of psychological manipulation, working to make me distrust my own mind. He was laying the groundwork to have me declared mentally incompetent, exactly as I had suspected. I looked at Lydia. She stood completely silent, eyes averted quietly, letting her husband paint me as a senile, confused old fool. I understood in that precise moment that confronting them head-on right now would be a tactical disaster. If I pushed back hard, if I called the police in a rage, they would use every bit of my emotional reaction as documented proof of my supposed mental instability. They would accelerate whatever plan they were running. I had to swallow my pride. I had to play the role they had scripted for me down to the last detail. I let my shoulders drop in surrender. "I suppose my mind is playing tricks on me," I whispered. I walked away. In the hallway mirror, I caught Brendan smirking triumphantly at Lydia. I went down the basement stairs one step at a time, concentrating on the physical sensation of the wood beneath my shoes to keep myself anchored. That cruel smirk in the mirror was burned into me. It was the confirmation I had needed. Brendan wasn't simply stealing from me. He was building a case, constructing a narrative of mental decline brick by brick. If a frail 70-year-old man claims his jewelry is being stolen, and his own daughter and son-in-law insist he simply lost it, due to a failing memory, society will side with the younger generation every time. It was a terrifyingly clean, flawless strategy. I sat alone on my basement bed and let the cold truth settle over me. I was locked in a psychological cage match with a man who had no moral floor, and my own daughter was his silent partner. I knew I couldn't confront them directly again. I had to become invisible, had to become the exact, frail, pathetic old man they needed me to be, while keeping the sharp, analytical mind of a master engineer running quietly in the background. 2 days passed in a tense, manufactured calm. I played my role without a single slip. I asked Lydia the same mundane question twice within 1 hour. I intentionally left my reading glasses in the kitchen and put on a look of genuine bewilderment when Brendan made a production of discovering them in the living room. Each time I played the fool, I watched that familiar, sickening satisfaction move across Brendan's face. He was arrogant, and arrogance is where careless mistakes are born. On Thursday afternoon, the weather was sharp and clear. I put on my heavy wool coat and my walking shoes and went up to the kitchen where Lydia was putting together a late lunch, and Brendan sat typing furiously on his laptop at the island. I announced in a weak, slightly unsteady voice that I was heading out for a long walk around the neighborhood to clear my foggy head. Lydia barely glanced up from the cutting board, just a dismissive nod. Brendan didn't acknowledge me at all. I went out the front door and made sure to pull it shut with a loud, definitive thud. I walked the length of the driveway and turned the corner, stepping out of their line of sight. But I didn't keep walking. I stood still for exactly 10 minutes behind the large brick pillar of my neighbor's fence. Then I turned back. I moved quietly, keeping close to the thick evergreen hedges running along the perimeter of the estate. I came up to the tall wooden side gate that opened into the backyard. I knew the latch was slightly rusted and liable to squeak, so I lifted the heavy panel as I worked the latch, letting it swing open in complete silence. I slipped into the backyard and tucked myself behind the large, weeping willow near the edge of the stone patio. That garden was my absolute pride and joy. Gloria and I had spent countless weekends planting the azalea bushes, laying the slate pathways, and building the large wooden pergola that threw shade across the yard through the humid summer months. It was a space made for quiet reflection and family. But today, the sanctity of that garden was being violated in front of my eyes. Standing squarely in the middle of the manicured lawn was Brendan. He wasn't alone. 3 men I had never laid eyes on stood with him. They weren't dressed in the casual clothes of neighborhood acquaintances or the polo shirts of local contractors. They wore sharp, meticulously tailored dark suits and expensive leather shoes that looked entirely wrong, sinking into the soft winter grass. One of them had a thick cigar going casually flicking gray ash onto Gloria's prized rose bushes. Another held a leather portfolio taking notes with a sleek silver pen. They moved with a predatory ease, eyes sweeping the property, the slate roof, the custom windows, the deep wooded lot line. Brendan stood at the center of the group chest, out hands planted on his hips, with the confidence of a man who owned every inch of the ground beneath him. He was pointing toward the main structure of the house arm, sweeping wide in broad, commanding gestures. He was giving them a guided tour of my estate, carrying himself with the absolute authority of a wealthy landowner showing off his domain. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still behind the draping branches of the weeping willow. The biting wind carried their voices cleanly across the open lawn. I concentrated on Brendan's words, filtering out the rustling leaves and the faint hum of distant traffic. "As you can see, gentlemen," Brendan said, his voice swelling with a sickening manufactured bravado. "The property sits on over 2 acres of prime, fully developed real estate in one of the most exclusive zip codes in the entire state. The structural integrity is flawless, and the market value has absolutely skyrocketed over the last 5 years alone." The man with the cigar drew a long, slow pull and pushed the thick smoke out into the crisp air. He studied the main house, eyes narrowing in cold calculation. "It is a substantial asset, Brendan. I will give you that. The location is excellent. But we need absolute assurances. Our capital is not a charity fund. If we bridge this gap for your company, we need to know the asset is fully unencumbered and completely accessible." Brendan laughed, smooth, deeply arrogant, a sound that turned my stomach with revulsion. He moved closer to the men and lowered his voice just slightly, but not nearly enough. "I understand your concerns, gentlemen, but I promise you there is absolutely zero risk here. You have seen the initial paperwork I provided. The collateral is rock solid. My inheritance is guaranteed." The word inheritance struck me like a physical blow. A man cannot inherit an estate from a living father-in-law. An inheritance only changes hands when the current owner is dead or legally stripped of every right and asset he holds. My mind moved fast, connecting the pieces, the shredded bank letter, the missing diamonds, the gaslighting, and this secret tour of my home. They were leveraging my house to finance his failing ambitions. The man with the leather portfolio stopped writing and looked up, his gaze drifting toward the basement windows of my suite. He tapped his silver pen against the dark leather. "What about the current title holder?" he asked, his tone flat and purely transactional. "What about the old man? Is he going to create a legal problem for us when the transfer goes through?" Brendan pushed his hands into the pockets of his expensive wool coat. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face, one that revealed a darkness I had never truly understood until that precise second. He looked back at the grand house I had built to shelter the family I loved, his eyes completely empty of human feeling. "Don't worry about Wallace," Brendan said, his voice dropping to a cold, ruthless whisper that cut through the freezing winter air. "He won't be a problem much longer." Those words hung in the cold air like a verdict, an absolute promise of my erasure. The paralysis that had gripped me for weeks dissolved on the spot, replaced by a crystalline, merciless clarity. Brendan was not merely a greedy opportunist pilfering jewelry. He was a dangerous predator actively engineering my destruction. I waited until the men in tailored suits finally shook Brendan's hand and walked to their luxury vehicles. I listened as Brendan whistled a cheerful tune and strolled casually back into my house, as though he'd just claimed a kingdom. The moment the heavy back door clicked shut behind him, I retraced my steps, slipped quietly through the rusted side gate, and came back inside through the cold basement. A seasoned structural engineer understands that when a building is on the verge of total collapse, you don't patch deep cracks with cheap plaster. You brace the failing foundation with heavy cold steel. I could no longer fight this silent psychological war on nothing but my own limited observations. I needed a professional. I needed a shark. The following morning, I dressed carefully in my best wool trousers and a crisp collared shirt. I went slowly upstairs to the bright kitchen, where Lydia was casually working through a green smoothie. I told her in the frailest, most hollowed-out voice I could manage that I was catching the city bus down to the community center for a game of chess. She barely looked in my direction, just a cold, dismissive wave. I went out the front door, leaning heavily on a wooden walking cane, playing the part of the broken man they had decided I was. 3 quiet blocks away, I straightened my back, folded the cane, and ordered an Uber. The long ride into downtown Atlanta was a blur of gray concrete. I watched the towering corporate buildings slide past massive structures standing tall and defiant against the skyline. I drew a quiet, steady strength from them. I was Wallace Crane, a man who had built monuments that withstood hurricanes. I would not let a pathetic, arrogant parasite bring my life down. The black Uber left me at a sleek high-rise on Peachtree Street. I rode the express elevator straight to the 34th floor and stepped into the plush, formidable reception area of Faber and Associates. Conrad Faber was not simply a lawyer. He was a ruthless, legal mercenary. For 30 years, he had been my exclusive corporate attorney, aggressively defending my engineering firm against frivolous lawsuits and steering through complex municipal contracts. He ate corporate predators for breakfast. The polished receptionist recognized me immediately and walked me directly into Conrad's massive corner office. Conrad sat behind a great slab of polished mahogany, a sharp, imposing man with silver hair and hawk-like eyes that missed nothing. He looked up, clearly caught off guard by my arrival, but stood without hesitation and extended his hand. I didn't waste a moment on pleasantries. I settled into the leather chair, reached into my pocket, and set the small pouch containing the shredded, taped-together bank letter on his immaculate desk. Then I told him everything. I laid out the slow, grinding invasion of my home, The destroyed antique vanity, the stolen diamond necklace, the secret tour of the garden, and every word of the chilling exchange I had overheard. Conrad listened with a terrifying absolute stillness, his sharp eyes visibly hardening with a cold and highly professional fury. He lifted the reconstructed bank letter and examined it carefully under the bright glow of his desk lamp. "Wallace," Conrad finally said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "This is not a simple, isolated case of elder abuse. This is a highly orchestrated financial crime. They are actively working to liquidate your entire life." Conrad turned immediately to his computer, fingers moving fast across the keyboard. I'm pulling the county property records right now," he muttered, his focus absolute. "I also have direct channels into the fraud department at your bank. If they initiated a home equity line of credit using your property as collateral, the digital footprint will be sitting right there in the centralized database." The grand office fell into a tense, suffocating silence. I sat with the frantic clicking of his keyboard filling the room. Every passing second stretched like an hour. I watched his eyes narrow as he scrolled rapidly through dense screens of financial data. Then he stopped cold. He let out a sharp, bitter breath and leaned back hard in his leather chair. "It is infinitely worse than you thought, Wallace," Conrad said grimly. "The $1.5 million line of credit is absolutely real, and it is not just sitting in preliminary application. It is currently in the final underwriting stage. The bank has already completed a drive-by appraisal of your entire estate. The funds are scheduled to be dispersed into a newly created joint account in exactly 14 days. In 2 short weeks, Brendan will have direct, unfettered access to $1.5 million of your home's equity." The warmth drained completely from my face. "How is that even remotely possible, Conrad? I never spoke to a single loan officer. I never signed a single application. They need a physical signature. They need a certified notary. They absolutely need my physical presence to authorize a loan against an unencumbered property." Conrad's expression turned grimmer still. He opened a new tab, navigated to a specific legal database, and pulled up a file. The office printer hummed to life, producing a thick stack of warm pages. Conrad stapled the corner and slid the heavy damning document slowly across the mahogany desk toward me. "Before I tell you what Wallace was about to uncover, and just how deep the betrayal really ran, let me ask you something. If you suspected someone close to you was working against you in secret, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you stay quiet and build your case from the shadows? Think about that. Because what comes next changed everything. They didn't need your physical presence at all, Wallace," Conrad said quietly, pressing his index finger hard against the top page. "Because legally speaking, you gave them absolute, undisputed permission to do whatever they want." I stared down at the document. The bold black letters printed at the top of the page seemed to burn directly into my retinas. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. I read through the terrifying, legally binding clauses. The document granted Lydia Crane Hurst complete and total control over all of my financial assets, my personal banking accounts, my real estate holdings, and my healthcare decisions. It legally declared her fully authorized to act as my sole agent in all matters, effectively stripping me of my autonomy. "I never drafted this," I whispered, my voice breaking with profound horror. "I have never laid eyes on this document in my life." "Look closely at the bottom of the very last page, Wallace," Conrad instructed, his steady tone carrying a simmering, lethal anger beneath it. I flipped frantically through the thick stack of pages. There, at the very bottom of the final sheet, right beside the official blue stamp of a deeply negligent notary public, was my signature. It was not some hasty, sloppy imitation. It was a flawless, perfect replication of my personal handwriting, every flowing loop, every sharp angle, every subtle point of pressure, exactly as I had signed thousands of architectural blueprints across a 40-year career. It was a master forgery. The brutal weight of Conrad's revelation settled over that grand office like a physical thing. Brendan was not simply a greedy opportunist looking to pocket jewelry or live rent-free under my roof. He was a dangerous, calculating predator who had methodically plotted my complete ruin. Conrad stared at the document jaw set so hard I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. For a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the brutal currents of corporate litigation, genuine shock was a rarity. But this a brazen act of criminality executed against someone he considered a long-standing friend had crossed a deeply personal line. He set the paper carefully back onto the polished mahogany and met my eyes with a cold, unwavering determination. We were no longer dealing with an entitled son-in-law. We were dealing with a cornered, desperate criminal who had systematically worked to strip me of every asset I had built across 40 years of hard work. Wallace, we cannot afford to simply react, Conrad said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. If we file a police report right now on the strength of this forgery, Brendan will know immediately that we're onto him. He'll panic. He'll shred whatever physical evidence is still in your house, drain every liquid account he can reach, and potentially flee the jurisdiction entirely. Or worse, he'll move up whatever physical timeline he has planned for you. We need overwhelming, airtight proof of the entire operation before we strike. We need to dismantle him completely. I nodded slowly, feeling a cold, dark resolve settle into my bones. The shock was gone, replaced by the precise, analytical mindset of a structural engineer mapping a building for controlled demolition. What is our next move, Conrad? Conrad reached for his desk phone and pressed a single button on the intercom. He told his secretary to clear his entire afternoon and bring in a man named Reginald Stowe. 20 minutes later, the heavy oak door swung open. Reginald was a former federal forensic accountant who now ran an elite, highly discreet private investigation firm serving high-net-worth clients caught in complex financial extortion. He was a quiet, understated man, but his eyes moved through the room like instruments cataloging, measuring, missing nothing. Conrad walked him through the situation, quickly sliding the forged power of attorney and the reassembled bank letter across the desk. Reginald reviewed both documents without a word, his expression completely unreadable. I want a full shadow investigation into Brendan Hurst, Conrad said firmly. I want to know where every cent of his money originates and exactly where it lands. I want the truth about this technology company he claims to be operating out of my client's home. Dig into his personal accounts, his digital footprint, his business filings. Leave nothing untouched. Reginald gave a single nod, gathered the files into a sleek leather briefcase, and stood. Give me exactly 72 hours. I'll bring you the complete structural breakdown of his life. For the next 3 days, my own home felt like an active war zone, where the enemy had no idea the battle had already begun. I kept playing the frail, mentally fading father without a slip. I walked with a pronounced limp. I left the stove burner running until Lydia caught it, apologizing with convincing distress over my dangerous forgetfulness, while Brendan watched me with that sickening, triumphant smirk. Every time I looked at him, a violent surge of rage rose in my chest, and every time I forced it back down, I was buying Reginald the time he needed to expose the truth. On Friday morning, Conrad called my encrypted burner phone, a device he had personally purchased to ensure Brendan couldn't intercept our calls through the home network. He told me to come to the office immediately. When I arrived, Reginald was already seated in the leather chair across from Conrad's desk. The large glass table in the center of the room was buried under thick, color-coded financial dossiers. Reginald didn't bother with pleasantries. He pointed directly to the largest stack on the table. Your son-in-law is not a technology entrepreneur, Wallace. He began, his voice entirely clinical. The company he claims to be running, the one that supposedly requires your library as a corporate headquarters, is a complete sham. It is a legally registered entity, but it has zero operational infrastructure. No employees on payroll, no active clients, no viable products in development. It is nothing more than a hollow financial shell built to look legitimate on paper. I stared at the dossiers, feeling a cold wave of vindication. Then what exactly is he doing in my library for 10 hours a day? Reginald pulled a secondary folder from the table and opened it. He is aggressively day trading cryptocurrency, and he is spectacularly bad at it. Over the last 14 months, Brendan has systematically liquidated his entire personal savings, his retirement accounts, and a substantial portion of Lydia's inheritance from her grandmother. He gambled away nearly $700,000 chasing volatile digital coins on unregulated offshore exchanges. The sheer scale of the destruction knocked the air from my lungs. He had not only demolished his own financial future, he had actively gutted my daughter's financial security while smiling at me across the breakfast table every single morning. But losing his own money was not what triggered his current actions. Reginald continued, his tone growing darker. When the legitimate funds ran out 6 months ago, Brendan became desperate. He borrowed heavily, trying to claw back his losses, and he did not go to any standard bank. He went to unregulated, highly dangerous private lenders, loan sharks. He currently owes in excess of $400,000 in high-interest debt to people who do not send polite collection notices. They are threatening him. That is the pressure driving everything he is doing. That is precisely why he forged your signature to secure a $1.5 million line of credit against your unencumbered estate. He is literally attempting to save his own life by destroying yours. It all locked into place with a terrible absolute clarity. The aggressive takeover of my home, the destruction of Gloria's vanity to assert dominance, the interception of the Daily Mail. He was a drowning man, dragging me under the freezing water to keep himself afloat. We have enough of financial evidence right here to put him in federal prison for a decade, Conrad said, pressing both hands flat on the desk. We can initiate the legal strike tomorrow morning. There is one final piece of the puzzle you both need to see before you move. Reginald interrupted, drawing a single thin folder from his briefcase. He didn't slide it across the table. He held it, looking directly at me with a level of quiet, unmistakable human sympathy that was entirely out of character. During my digital investigation, I gained access to Brendan's deleted email archives and his private browser history, Reginald said softly. I needed to understand what his exit strategy was once the bank released the $1.5 million into the joint account. Taking the money is only half the equation. He still needed a permanent way to neutralize you, Wallace, to ensure you could never legally contest the fraudulent transfer or report the theft to law enforcement. A heavy, icy dread pooled in the pit of my stomach. What did he find? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Reginald opened the thin folder and set a printed email thread directly in front of me. 2 weeks ago, right around the time Brendan began convincing Lydia that your memory was failing, he contacted the admissions director of a highly exclusive private luxury nursing facility located in a remote part of rural Tennessee. It is a specialized high-security institution designed specifically for patients suffering from severe advanced stage dementia and profound cognitive decline. I looked down at the printed words, my eyes moving across the horrific calculated correspondence. Brendan had been actively negotiating the monthly care fees using my own stolen funds to cover the permanent accommodation. He sent them your medical records, Reginald continued grimly, heavily altered, to inflate your minor joint issues into major physical liabilities. He explicitly invoked the forged power of attorney to bypass your required consent for the medical transfer. He specifically inquired about their locked ward protocols. He wanted written assurance from the facility director that once a patient is admitted under a medical directive by a legal proxy, that patient cannot discharge themselves under any circumstances regardless of their perceived lucidity. The room tilted slightly. I gripped the wooden arms of the leather chair to hold myself steady. They were not simply planning to drain my finances and leave me destitute. They were planning to lock me away in a sealed remote medical facility. They intended to chemically sedate me, strip away my fundamental human rights, and leave me to disappear in a locked ward until I died alone and entirely forgotten. "When is the admission date?" I asked, forcing the words past the tight, suffocating constriction in my throat. Reginald looked down at the final page. "He finalized the involuntary admission paperwork yesterday afternoon. They are coming to collect you on Friday morning." I drew a slow, measured breath and let the reality of Friday morning settle into my bones. Today was Tuesday. I had exactly 72 hours to dismantle the trap they had built around my life. Knowing the truth was no longer enough. I needed undeniable evidence of their intent, their conspiracy captured in real time, not buried in financial documents. I needed them to confess to an empty room. To do that, I had to fully inhabit the helpless caricature they had painted of me. I had to become the broken old man they were so eager to cart away. On Wednesday morning, I set the plan in motion. I waited until I heard Brendan's footsteps pacing across the hardwood above, then climbed the stairs, making sure my breathing came out ragged and labored. As I reached the kitchen, I let my right leg buckle deliberately. I cried out sharply, grabbed the edge of the granite countertop, as if it were the only thing keeping me upright, and went down hard onto the floor. Lydia gasped and sent her ceramic coffee mug crashing into the sink. Brendan crouched and stared down at me with a cold, measuring look. "Dad, what happened?" Lydia asked, her voice shaking. "My back." I groaned, pressing a hand to my lower spine. "A severe spasm. I can barely move my legs. The pain is blinding." Brendan leaned in closer. "Do you need me to call an ambulance, Wallace? We can have you taken in for an evaluation." I knew precisely what an emergency room visit meant. Medical records made vulnerable and a fast lane straight to the locked facility he had already selected. I shook my head hard. "No hospitals," I rasped. "I just need rest. Help me get back down to my bed in this basement. I don't want to be a burden up here." The flicker of relief that moved across Brendan's face was unmistakable. A bedridden father-in-law confined to the basement was the ideal setup for an involuntary medical extraction on Friday morning. Brendan and Lydia practically hauled my dead weight down the narrow stairs. I groaned at every step, delivering the finest performance of my life. They lowered me onto the firm mattress. I closed my eyes and asked them to leave me in complete darkness so I could try to sleep. "We'll check on you later, Wallace," Brendan said smoothly. "Just rest. Don't try to move." I listened as their footsteps climbed back up the stairs. The heavy basement door clicked shut. I waited exactly 4 hours in total stillness. I did not move a single muscle. I lay there, calculating the optimal angles and fields of view for what was coming. At 6:00 that evening, I heard the muffled sounds of preparation drifting down from above. Lydia and Brendan were getting ready to go out. Brendan had been boasting about a crucial dinner with his new private investors at an upscale downtown steakhouse. I heard the front door close. The engine turned over with a heavy growl, tires crunching across the pavement as the car pulled away. The house dropped into hollow silence. I threw off the covers and stood up, spine straight, legs steady and strong. Tucked deep inside my heavy winter coat was a small black case Reginald had handed me the day before. Inside sat 4 military-grade high-definition micro cameras, sophisticated motion-activated recording units equipped with infrared night vision extreme wide-angle lenses and direct cellular uplink capability. I took the case and moved quickly up the basement stairs. I knew every structural beam, every concealed wire channel, and every shadow in these walls. I had built this house. I knew exactly how to wire it. I pulled a chair to the center of the living room, popped the cover off the corner smoke detector, and got to work. I spliced the first micro camera's wire into the electrical feed, drilled a microscopic hole for the lens to peer through. From the floor it was entirely invisible, perfectly concealed against the white ceiling. Next, I moved to the kitchen, the nerve center of their daily operation, the place where Brendan issued his directives, and Lydia offered her silent compliance. I climbed onto the granite countertop and reached into the dark recess above the highest cabinet. I secured the second camera, angling the lens downward to take in the full span of the kitchen island, and wired it into the hidden LED circuit. The final location was my former library, the belly of the beast, the room where he had shredded my mail, forged my signature, and conducted his business with dangerous loan sharks. I pushed through the heavy double doors, heart beating a calm, steady rhythm, and stepped inside. I needed 2 cameras in here to cover both the desk area and the main seating space. I crossed to the towering walnut bookshelves I had built with my own hands, pulled out a heavy volume on Beaux-Arts architecture, and carefully hollowed out the thick spine with a utility knife. I embedded the third camera inside the lens, hidden in the dark crease between the pages, offering a wide-angle view directly across the desk. For the fourth, I unscrewed the bronze heating vent near the bay window, secured the tiny unit against the inner metal wall, and angled the lens through the slanted grates. It delivered a clean cross-angle of the entire room. The full installation took exactly 5 hours. My muscles ached from the sustained labor, but my mind was running with absolute precision. I moved through every room I had touched carefully, erasing any trace of my presence, until the house looked exactly as they had left it. Then I descended back into the cold isolation of my basement suite, pulled the door quietly shut, and stood for a moment in the dark, with a profound sense of tactical satisfaction. I washed my hands, changed back into my sleeping clothes, and sat on the edge of the mattress. I reached under the pillow and pulled out the iPad Reginald had provided. I powered it on, launched the encrypted security application, and worked through the alphanumeric password sequence. The screen blinked twice as the loading cleared. The display divided into 4 crisp, high-definition video feeds. The grand living room, the pristine kitchen, and 2 perfect angles covering the library. The infrared sensors rendered the dark, empty house in sharp shades of gray and white. The audio pickup was extraordinarily sensitive, catching even the low, rhythmic ticking of the long case clock in the distant hallway. I settled back against the cold wall with the glowing iPad resting on my knees. I watched the 4 silent screens, the ultimate architect of my own defense, waiting patiently in the shadows. The digital trap was fully armed, powered, and recording. 20 minutes later, the unmistakable sound of tires rolling across the paved driveway came through the audio feeds with startling clarity. I fixed my eyes on the kitchen screen. The heavy front door swung open, throwing a long, stark shadow across the hardwood floor. Lydia and Brendan walked in together, laughing freely, entirely unaware they had just stepped onto a live, heavily monitored stage. The performance was about to begin. I was holding the director's script. I watched the tablet screen cast its cold light against the walls of my basement. Lydia and Brendan moved through the kitchen with an easy domestic rhythm. Brendan poured 2 glasses of red wine while Lydia picked at a platter of imported cheeses. They looked like a perfectly normal young couple winding down after a long day of meetings. To any casual observer, their exchanges were warm and unremarkable. But seen through the lens of my hidden cameras, their laughter rang hollow and sinister. I sat rigid on my mattress for hours, eyes moving between the video feeds and recording every frame. The timer in the corner of the screen rolled past midnight. The house above me went quiet. The kitchen feed darkened as Brendan killed the lights. Then the library screen flared into sharp monochrome clarity. The infrared sensors had caught movement. Brendan walked into my former sanctuary carrying a glass of amber liquid. He dropped heavily into the leather chair behind the desk and pressed his fingers against his temples. He no longer looked like the confident technology pioneer. In the cold infrared light, he looked like a worn-out man crushed under a tremendous weight. The silence in the basement was total except for the sound of my own heartbeat. I adjusted the volume on the tablet, making certain I would capture every word. A few minutes later, the heavy library doors swung open again. Lydia came into the room, wrapped in a thick cashmere robe, pulled the doors shut behind her, and turned the brass latch with a distinct click that came through my earphones with startling clarity. The atmosphere on screen shifted immediately. Every trace of domestic warmth between them was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating tension. I leaned in toward the glowing tablet and pressed the earbuds deeper into my ears. My heart drove itself against my ribs in a heavy, punishing rhythm. "Did you speak with the brokers today?" Lydia asked, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper as she moved back and forth across the Persian rug. Brendan took a slow pull from his glass and nodded, settling his elbows on the smooth desk surface. "I spent the afternoon locking in the wire transfer protocol," Brendan replied smoothly, his tone edged with a dark, triumphant energy. "The bank underwriters cleared the final property appraisal this morning. The financial paperwork is fully secured. Once the $1.5 million line of credit hits our joint account on the 26th of this month, the nightmare ends. We move the funds immediately. The private lenders get paid off by noon. Those violent animals will stop calling my numbers. My debts will be wiped clean." I watched my daughter stop pacing. She stood before the desk, arms folded tightly across her chest. I waited in the cold darkness for a natural human response, some acknowledgement of the magnitude of what they were doing to her own flesh and blood. I listened for a single trace of moral hesitation in her voice. "And what are we going to do about the secondary problem?" Lydia asked flatly, her voice entirely stripped of feeling. "We cannot celebrate being free if he is still moving around the house, phoning his bank or trying to reach his lawyer. We have to hold to the established timeline." The clinical detachment in her voice broke something inside me that I will never fully repair. She was speaking about her own father, as though I were a malfunctioning appliance to be disposed of, a logistical obstacle standing between her and her comfort. She didn't use my name. I was simply the secondary problem. Brendan smiled, a chilling, predatory expression that warped his features on the screen. He leaned back in the chair and swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "The secondary problem is already handled," Brendan told her, his voice thick with sickening arrogance. "The medical facility in rural Tennessee sent over the final admission manifest this afternoon. The locked ward has a private isolated suite prepared and waiting. We load your dad into the transport van on the morning of the 27th. The medical couriers handle the extraction from the house. We won't have to lift a single finger." Brendan paused for a deliberate sip before delivering the final blow. "The moment that transport van clears the driveway, we drive straight to the international airport. We're flying first class to Hawaii for New Year's Eve. We'll be drinking expensive champagne on the beach while he gets permanently settled into his new medicated home." I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with a toxic mixture of grief and white-hot rage. A deep ache radiated through my chest, threatening to suffocate me in that dark basement. My own daughter was conspiring to have me locked in a chemical prison so she could take a tropical vacation funded entirely by my stolen savings. I held my breath and waited for Lydia to speak. This was the absolute point of no return. Some foolish, shattered corner of my soul still clung to the hope that she would break, that she would finally recognize the monstrous nature of what they were doing and refuse to carry it forward. I wanted her to cry. I wanted her to defend me. Lydia did not cry. She did not defend her father. She did not show a flicker of remorse, hesitation, or human feeling. She simply uncrossed her arms, stepped closer to the glass desk, and looked down at her husband with an expression of cold, pure pragmatism. "Are you absolutely certain the specialized doctors will sign off on his severe dementia?" Lydia asked, her tone sharp and precise. "If the intake physicians question his lucidity during the initial psychiatric evaluation, they could reject the involuntary admission. The legal proxy means nothing if the medical staff determines he is fully competent and aware. We cannot afford any loose ends." Brendan gave a low chuckle, a dark, resonant sound that traveled clearly through my earphones. He reached into the bottom drawer of the desk and produced a thick, unmarked manila folder. He dropped it onto the glass surface with a dull, definitive thud. "You worry far too much, my love," Brendan said, tapping his index finger against the top of the folder. "I spent $10,000 of the advance money to bring in a private, highly unethical neurologist who specializes in discrete medical certifications. He never needed to meet your father in person to make his diagnosis. I supplied the doctor with a fully fabricated inventory of terrifying symptoms and aggressive behavioral episodes. He produced a completely airtight, detailed diagnostic report, officially confirming advanced cognitive decline and severe paranoia." Brendan lifted the forged medical file and gave it a slight wave as his dark smirk stretched into a wide, triumphant grin. "Already done?" The grin on Brendan's face burned through the glowing screen and seared itself into my memory permanently. "Already done." Those two words hung in the cold, damp air of the basement and sealed the death of the family I believed I knew. I sat on the edge of the mattress and watched the silent feed as Brendan casually dropped the forged file back into his drawer and locked it. Lydia gave a single nod, her face a mask of chilling indifference, then pulled her cashmere robe tighter and turned toward the library doors. I watched them leave, and the room dropped back into darkness. I did not weep. The suffocating grief that had been pressing against my chest only moments before dissolved, completely replaced at once by a cold and absolute resolve. The daughter I had raised with everything I had, the little girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose college tuition I had paid without a moment's hesitation, was gone. What stood in her place was a ruthless accomplice to a monstrous crime. They were not merely taking my home. They were taking my freedom, my dignity, and whatever future I had left. I pressed the power button on the iPad and let the darkness take the room. The time for grief was over. The time for total destruction had arrived. When I finally opened my eyes again, pale gray light was pressing through the single narrow window near the ceiling of my basement suite. It was the early morning of Christmas Eve. Outside, a thick layer of pristine white snow lay over the sweeping lawns of the estate, a picture-perfect winter scene that stood in sharp, bitter contrast to the ugliness rotting inside the walls of the house. For decades, Christmas Eve had been a sacred tradition within these rooms. Gloria would spend days baking cinnamon pastries, and the house filled with the warm scents of pine needles and roasting meats. We would sit together by the crackling fireplace, listening to classic carols, holding on to the simple warmth of our family. The holiday had become nothing more than a convenient countdown timer, marking the final hours before everything was set to detonate. Tomorrow was the 26th of December. Tomorrow was the day the $1.5 million line of credit was scheduled to clear. Tomorrow was the day they planned to pay off the violent loan sharks. And the day after the 27th was the day the medical transport van was supposed to roll up and haul me away to a locked dementia ward. I threw back the thin blankets and got to my feet, ignoring the sharp cold of the concrete floor biting through my soles. My performance had to remain flawless, not a single crack. I dressed deliberately, selecting a faded, slightly wrinkled flannel shirt and baggy trousers to sell the image of a man visibly falling apart. In the small bathroom mirror, I practiced a hollow, unfocused stare, letting my shoulders cave forward. I picked up the wooden cane I had left strategically beside the door and began my slow, punishingly loud climb up the wooden stairs. I pushed through the heavy door into the main hallway and shuffled toward the kitchen. The great room hummed with the bright, restless energy of holiday preparations. Lydia stood at the granite countertop carefully arranging an expensive charcuterie board with practiced elegance while Brendan leaned against the stainless steel refrigerator, thumbs moving fast across his sleek smartphone. My arrival shifted the room's atmosphere barely, but enough to notice. Good morning, Dad. Lydia said, her voice threaded with a bright, entirely manufactured warmth. Her eyes never once found mine. They stayed fixed on the block of aged cheese she was slicing. Did you sleep all right down there? I know the furnace can run a bit loud, but we wanted to be sure you were nice and warm. Well, I slept fine, Lydia. I answered, letting my voice shake with a carefully calibrated feebleness. My back is still terribly stiff. The cold gets deep into my joints this time of year. Brendan tucked his phone into the pocket of his tailored slacks and moved to the kitchen island, wrapping both hands around a steaming mug of black coffee. He fixed me with that look, the one I had come to despise, with a white-hot fury, patronizing pity worn like a mask. It took everything I had not to wipe it off his face. You need to take it easy today, Wallace, Brendan said smoothly, his voice draped in a thick, suffocating layer of false concern. With your memory the way it's been and your health visibly going downhill, you really must avoid putting yourself under any unnecessary stress. We've been looking into cognitive decline, and overly stimulating environments are genuinely harmful. You just need to rest your mind. Let us carry the weight for the family. We have everything handled. The sheer gall of those words nearly knocked the breath out of me. He was laying the final psychological groundwork for my disappearance, carefully conditioning me to embrace the role of helpless burden without resistance. I lowered myself slowly into a wooden chair at the breakfast nook, gripping the curved handle of my cane with trembling, spotted hands. You're right, Brendan, I murmured, gazing blankly at the polished hardwood floor. My mind feels so foggy lately. I can't seem to hold a thought together anymore. I'm grateful for everything you're both doing. Brendan flicked a quick, triumphant glance at Lydia. He believed I was completely broken. He was convinced that 8 months of relentless pressure had ground my spirit to dust and shattered whatever strength I had left. He had absolutely no idea I was simply waiting, coiled and still, for the precise moment to blow the ground out from under him. After picking at a small bowl of plain oatmeal in suffocating silence, I excused myself, claiming the kitchen's bright lights were driving a terrible headache through my skull. I shuffled back down the hallway, leaning hard on my cane, and descended into the dark solitude of the basement. The instant the heavy door clicked shut, the frail old man dissolved completely. I straightened to my full height, dropped the wooden cane onto the mattress, and drew the encrypted burner phone from my coat's inner pocket. I settled at the small corner desk and composed a fully encrypted message to Conrad Faber. We had mapped this exact sequence of moves across weeks of careful planning. The legal trap was fully primed, its steel jaws cocked and ready. The timeline, it is absolutely confirmed, I typed without hesitation. At $500, the heavy basement door groaned open. Brendan stepped down onto the bottom stair in an immaculate, dark, pewter suit. He looked down at me with naked, undisguised contempt. "Listen carefully, Wallace." Brendan said, his voice hard-edged and commanding. "I have important investors coming for a private Christmas dinner tonight. You are an embarrassment. Stay in the basement. Don't make a sound." I gave a small, vacant nod to the empty room, a silent wolf wrapped in wool waiting patiently for the dawn. The door clicked shut again, sealing me in the cold and the dark. I did not lie down on the mattress. I waited a measured 2 hours until the muffled sounds of crystal clinking and low, satisfied laughter seeped through the floorboards above. The dinner party was in full motion. I crossed to the small closet and peeled off the flannel shirt and the baggy trousers. I reached to the very back and retrieved the protective garment bag I had concealed there days earlier. Inside was my finest bespoke suit, a tailored midnight black wool masterpiece with a crisp white shirt. I fastened each button with steady, exact movements. I formed the deep navy silk tie into a perfect knot. I stepped into my polished leather cap toes. I stood before the small bathroom mirror and studied the man looking back at me. The stooped, trembling figure was completely gone. Standing in his place was Wallace Crane, master structural engineer, the man who raised skyscrapers from steel and raw concrete. I squared my shoulders and felt a surge of absolute power move through me like current. I picked up the glowing iPad from the bed and pulled up the live video feed. The dining room camera showed Brendan sitting at the head of my long mahogany table pouring expensive wine for 4 men. I zoomed in tight on their faces. I recognized each one instantly from the thick financial dossiers Reginald had assembled. They weren't wearing the sharp, immaculate dark suits from the secret garden tour. They'd dressed down expensive casual wear, an attempt to dissolve into a suburban holiday scene. But I knew precisely who they were. These were the dangerous, unregulated private lenders Brendan owed his life to. Ruthless men who lived in the shadow economy and collected debts without mercy. Brendan was selling them a beautifully constructed lie. I listened to his smooth, self-assured voice through the hidden audio feed. He was assuring them their capital was completely secure, that his technology venture stood on the edge of a massive public offering, and that their principal plus enormous interest would be returned before the week was out. He was buying their patience with my stolen money and my aged bourbon. I set the iPad down and drew a slow breath. The time had come to tear the whole rotting structure apart. I walked to the foot of the wooden stairs. I left the cane where it lay on the cold concrete floor. I climbed with firm, heavy, deliberate steps. I made no effort to soften my approach. I wanted every footfall to announce itself. I reached the main hallway and turned toward the grand dining room. The heavy double doors stood partially closed. Through them, I could hear Lydia laughing at something one of the loan sharks had said, hollow, performative laughter that rang through the house like something hollow. I set both hands on the polished brass handles and drove the mahogany doors open. They swung back with a resonant, authoritative crash that rang through the room like a gunshot. The laughter cut off instantly. The crystal went silent. 5 heads snapped toward me in unison. Lydia's silver fork fell against her bone china plate with a sharp clatter. Every trace of color left her face, leaving something that looked less like a woman and more like a ghost. Brendan froze mid-pour, the dark wine spilling over the rim of the glass and bleeding across the pristine white tablecloth like a fresh wound. He stared at me in absolute paralyzed shock. He was looking at a man who was supposed to be a broken, cowering wreck hidden away in the dark. He was looking at a man standing tall, impeccably dressed, radiating a cold and lethal authority. The veins in Brendan's neck rose as his shock curdled rapidly into undisguised panic. He slammed the bottle down on the table and shoved his chair back with a harsh scrape that cut through the silence like something jagged. "Wallace!" Brendan shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of desperate manufactured outrage as he scrambled to hold his crumbling performance together in front of his dangerous creditors. "What are you doing up here? I told you specifically to stay downstairs. You're confused again. You're having another episode. We have important business guests." He wheeled quickly toward the four men, forcing out a strained, perspiring smile. "I apologize, gentlemen. My father-in-law has advanced dementia. He wanders from his room in a state of severe delusion. I'll have him safely guided back to bed." Brendan moved aggressively toward me, both hands reaching out to seize my shoulders and physically drag me from the room. I did not flinch. I did not give an inch of ground. I stood there like a column of solid iron. When he closed the gap between us, I raised my right hand and pressed a single steady finger toward his chest. "If you put one hand on me inside my own home, Brendan, I will make certain you spend what remains of your miserable life inside a federal prison cell." My voice carried absolute zero warmth, pure, cold command. Brendan stopped dead. His hands hung suspended in midair. The authority in my tone, stripped of every trace of frailty or confusion, tore his entire narrative apart at the seams. I left his trembling figure where it stood and turned my gaze directly to the four men seated at my table. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, addressing the loan sharks with a measured, chilling courtesy. "I regret the interruption, but the man at the head of this table has been feeding you lies. My son-in-law is not a technology entrepreneur. He does not own a startup. He has not a single legitimate client to his name. He has burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars on unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. I know exactly who each of you is, and I know precisely why you are sitting in my dining room. He owes you in excess of $400,000 in high-interest private debt. He promised you an enormous return by the 26th of this month." Not one of the four men spoke, but the relaxed ease they'd carried into the room evaporated on the spot. They straightened in their chairs, eyes narrowing to dark, predatory slits, as their full collective attention swung onto Brendan's sweat-drenched, panicking face. Lydia let out a muffled sob and buried her face in both hands. Brendan was hyperventilating, his chest, lurching, his entire fraudulent world collapsing around him in real time. "You are completely out of your mind," Brendan shrieked, spinning to face the silent men. "He's delusional. He has no idea what he's saying. I'm calling an ambulance right now." He lunged toward the heavy front door in the foyer, reaching for his coat. I moved to intercept, closing my hand around the brass doorknob. Brendan sneered. He thought the broken old man was retreating into the cold. Instead, I turned the lock and pulled the door wide open. Freezing air flooded through the frame, carrying a swirl of snowflakes into the foyer. Standing in the doorway framed against the winter night was Conrad Faber, flanked by two armed police officers. Red and blue lights strobed across the front lawn in chaotic pulses. Conrad stepped across the threshold, his overcoat dusted with snow. He moved with the unhurried certainty of a man delivering a final verdict. The officers filed in behind him, sweeping their eyes across the dining room. The moment law enforcement entered the space, the atmosphere fractured. The room erupted into chaos. Seated at the far end of the table, half hidden behind the centerpiece, were Brendan's parents. They had clearly been brought in to prop up the fiction of a warm, prosperous family gathering for the benefit of the private lenders. When the armed officers pushed into the house, Brendan's mother let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. The crystal wine glass slipped free from her fingers. It dropped and shattered against the floor, exploding into a shower of glittering fragments. The sound rang up into the vaulted ceiling. Brendan's father lurched to his feet, face drained to a pale ashen gray, frozen solid by the sudden intrusion. The four loan sharks showed no fear. What surfaced instead was hardened instinctive aggression. These were men who operated deep in the dangerous margins of the financial world. The sight of police officers triggered something primal in them. They shoved their heavy chairs back from the table. One reached with quiet deliberateness toward the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. The lead officer caught the movement immediately and issued a firm, flat command for the man to keep both hands visible on the tablecloth. The loan shark complied slowly, his dark eyes sending a look of pure venom across the table at Brendan. They understood now the profitable story they'd been sold was a fabrication from start to finish. Brendan stood trapped at the center of the room chest, heaving eyes working frantically to process an impossible situation. His gaze ricocheted between the armed officers, the furious loan sharks, his terrified parents, and me. Every trace of the arrogance that defined him had evaporated, replaced by the raw, sweating panic of a cornered animal. He raised his hands. "Gentlemen, everyone please stay calm." Brendan stammered, pushing out a weak and trembling smile. "This is a massive misunderstanding. My father-in-law is severely senile. He is suffering from advanced dementia. He has completely lost his grip on reality. He must have phoned the police during a confused episode, hallucinating that something was wrong. I assure you, my company is fully solvent. The capital transfer is proceeding exactly as scheduled. This is a medical situation. Please." Brendan swung his desperate gaze toward Conrad. "Officers, you have to hear me out." Brendan pressed his words, tumbling fast. "You are responding to a false alarm placed by a mentally incompetent man. I am his primary caregiver. I hold his legal power of attorney. Step outside with me for one moment, and I can show you his full medical file. I can demonstrate conclusively that he is suffering from severe cognitive decline. There is no crime taking place here." Conrad Faber stepped forward and halted at the edge of the dining room rug. He looked down at Brendan with an expression of absolute unmovable contempt and drew a thick sheaf of folded legal documents from his coat. "Save your breath, Mr. Hurst." Conrad's deep voice landed in the room like something heavy and final. "We are not here for a wellness check. We are executing coordinated arrest warrants for severe financial fraud. Wire fraud conspiracy to commit extortion and the falsification of medical records. The district attorney had already frozen your private accounts, including the joint account you illegally opened 3 weeks ago. The $1.5 million line of credit has been permanently canceled. This is finished." Brendan lurched backward a full step. The full weight of Conrad's words crushed what remained of his defense. Lydia let out a loud wail and sank to her knees. Brendan's mother dissolved into uncontrollable sobbing, clinging to her husband. The loan sharks stayed seated, their expressions hardening into masks of cold, calculating fury. Their only concern was that their money was gone, and the man who owed it was headed to federal prison. Brendan looked at me, his eyes burning with raw hatred and disbelief. He leveled a shaking finger at my face, his voice dropping to a vicious, low hiss as he clawed for whatever remained of his ground. "You have absolutely no tangible proof of anything," Brendan spat, gripping his last lie with both hands. "You are a bitter old man throwing around wild accusations. You cannot prove a single word. It's your word against mine, and the medical community has already documented that your mind is failing. You cannot prove anything." I did not raise my voice. I stood tall near the open doorway, entirely unmoved by his thrashing. Reaching into my trouser pocket, I drew out my digital iPad with quiet, deliberate calm. The screen showed the live control panel for the hidden micro cameras and integrated audio feeds I had installed with great care throughout the house. I held Brendan's panicked gaze. I watched the precise moment the realization hit him, the instant the ground gave way beneath his feet. He remembered the total privacy of his library. He remembered the deeply incriminating conversation he had held behind a locked door. He understood at last that the frail old man had never been real. I lifted the iPad slightly, my thumb resting above the audio playback control. The house ran on a high-fidelity Bluetooth sound system I had personally wired into the ceiling speakers of every room on the main floor years ago. "I don't need to prove a single thing, Brendan," I said quietly, my voice carrying a chilling and absolute finality. "You are going to prove it for me." I pressed the screen. At once, the crisp, unmistakable audio of Brendan's own voice filled the living room, the foyer, and the grand dining room through the hidden speakers. "The secondary problem is already handled." Brendan's recorded voice rang out through the house. "The medical facility in rural Tennessee sent over the final admission manifest this afternoon. The locked ward has a private, isolated suite ready for him. We load your dad into the transport van on the morning of the 27th. Once that van clears the driveway, we drive straight to the airport. We are flying first class to Hawaii for New Year's Eve." My daughter's recorded voice followed, cold and precise. "Are you absolutely sure the specialized doctors will sign off on his severe dementia? You worry far too much, my love." Brendan's recorded voice replied, brimming with a sickening, triumphant arrogance. "I spent $10,000 of the advance money on a private, deeply unethical neurologist. He produced a completely airtight, highly detailed diagnostic report, officially confirming advanced cognitive decline and severe paranoia. Already done." The recording continued, looping through the house without pause. I stood perfectly still and watched every trace of color leave Brendan's face as his own damning words closed in around him from every direction. The trap had sprung. The finality of that recorded voice rang off the vaulted dining room ceiling like a sentence being read aloud. The four private lenders had heard enough. Men like these carry a predator's instinct for a collapsing investment, and it took them only seconds to understand that the profitable story they'd been confidently sold was nothing but a desperate fiction dissolving in front of them. The lead loan shark rose slowly from the mahogany table. He did not so much as glance at the armed officers planted in the foyer. His dark, furious eyes found Brendan and locked on. The unspoken threat radiating off the man was something you could almost feel against your skin. He knew his $400,000 was gone, and his intentions regarding that deficit were written plainly on his face. Brendan was sealed inside the suffocating cage he had constructed for himself. He retreated from the table, his shoes losing grip for a moment on the polished floor. The untouchable tech visionary had ceased to exist, replaced by a trembling coward who had finally grasped that every predator in the room was more dangerous than he was. He threw his hands up, his gaze careening wildly between the loan sharks, the police officers, and my immovable stance. "Listen to me, gentlemen. Please just listen to me." Brendan's voice broke apart with raw desperation. He gestured frantically around the room. "No, the money is completely guaranteed. I swear to you the money is secure. This property is fully appraised at $2.12 million. It is rock-solid collateral. The home equity line of credit is already underwritten and approved. It clears tomorrow morning. The full $1.5 million hits the account tomorrow. Every one of you will be paid in full with the promised interest. Do not listen to this confused old man or this fabricated recording. I hold the legal binding power of attorney. I have total control of the assets. He spun toward Conrad Faber, thrusting a shaking finger in his direction. You cannot stop a legally binding financial transfer. Brendan sneered, fighting to resurrect some ghost of his old bravado. I submitted all the required notarized paperwork. The bank has already processed the property lien. I am the designated legal proxy for this estate. You are trespassing, and you are actively obstructing a federally regulated financial transaction. Conrad Faber did not blink. The corporate litigator advanced into the full brightness of the dining room chandelier. He moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who has already won and knows it. He carried a thick, substantial legal binder bound in dark blue leather. He said nothing as he approached the mahogany table. He simply raised the binder and set it down on the polished surface with a single definitive thud that rang through the room like a gavel and silenced Brendan's frantic rambling on the spot. Conrad unbuttoned his overcoat and fixed Brendan with a look of complete, undiluted legal contempt. He set both palms flat on the cover of the binder. You are a remarkably stupid man, Mr. Hurst. Conrad's voice was a low, resonant baritone that absorbed every other sound in the room. You believed you could forge a single document and walk away with a lifetime of accumulated wealth. You thought you were playing checkers against a defenseless old man. But my client has been playing high-stakes chess for 40 years, and he spotted you from a considerable distance. You are standing here shouting about using this property as collateral for a commercial loan. There is one enormous, insurmountable problem with that strategy. You cannot borrow against an asset that does not belong to you. Brendan stared at him, his face contorting with genuine, uncomprehending confusion. His chest rose and fell rapidly as his mind tried to find a foothold in what he'd just heard. What are you talking about? Brendan managed his voice frail and hollow, his eyes cutting toward Lydia, who was still crumpled on the floor in tears. Wallace has owned this estate for 30 years. The deed is in his name. I pulled the county property records myself. I stepped away from the foyer and moved to stand directly beside Conrad. I looked at the man who had schemed to lock me inside a chemical fog for whatever years I had remaining, and I felt something deep and settled rise in my chest. The time for operating in the shadows was over. You pulled those county records 8 months ago, Brendan, when you first moved into my home and began mapping out your little takeover. I said, my voice unhurried and exact. You assumed the foundation of everything I'd built would sit perfectly still while you worked to undermine it. But a master engineer never leaves his most valuable assets without protection. I reached across and opened the heavy cover of the blue binder. I turned past the index tabs and laid my finger on the primary notarized document at the front. The moment I caught the first irregularity in my bank statements, the moment my antique vanity was mysteriously destroyed, I knew precisely what I was dealing with. I held his terrified gaze without wavering. I did not sit in that basement and simply wait for you to finish me. 4 weeks ago, I quietly executed a complete legal restructuring of my entire financial portfolio. I removed my name from everything. This $2.5 million estate, my investment accounts, every liquid asset I hold, all of it was transferred directly into a fully secured, irrevocable trust. Brendan's jaw dropped open. Whatever color had remained in his face drained away, leaving something pallid and slack. He understood the legal terminology exactly. He knew what it meant. I do not own this house, Brendan. I delivered the words like the last structural pin being pulled from a failing bridge. The trust owns it. I am a beneficiary residing on the premises, nothing more. An irrevocable trust cannot be touched, modified, or leveraged through a standard power of attorney. The document you spent weeks carefully forging, the one you used to illegally secure a $1.5 million line of credit from a federally insured institution is fraudulent and entirely void. The silence that fell over the dining room had real weight to it. The four private lenders stood motionless, their eyes trained on Brendan. The arithmetic was not complicated. No equity, no transfer clearing in the morning, no money coming back to them at all. Brendan had borrowed against a mirage, and the mirage had just burned away. Brendan stumbled back a half step, his knees softening under the full mass of what had collapsed on him. He looked at the police officers standing patiently in the foyer with steel handcuffs in hand. He looked at the loan sharks, who would undoubtedly be there the instant he ever managed to post bail. He had committed documented bank fraud against a federal institution, and he owed violent men a sum he could never hope to repay. He had built an exquisite trap, but it was his own ankles locked in the jaws. The oppressive quiet was broken by the sound of wooden chair legs dragging across the hardwood floor. All four private lenders rose in unison. No shouting, no sudden movements. Men who operate in that particular profession do not squander energy on theatrical displays when armed officers are standing a few feet away. The lead loan shark, the man who had been pleasantly sipping my aged bourbon only minutes before, buttoned his jacket with slow, unhurried hands. He walked around the edge of the mahogany table and came to a stop mere inches from Brendan. Brendan shrank back, shoulders shaking, eyes wide with the kind of fear that lives beneath conscious thought. The lender leaned in close, and when he spoke, his voice dropped to a hard, graveled whisper that still reached every corner of the quiet room. You have exactly 48 hours to produce our capital Hearst. If you go to jail, we will wait. If you post bail, we will find you. There is no place remote enough to keep you out of reach. He did not wait for any reply. He straightened his cuffs, put his back to the trembling man, and walked to the foyer. The armed officers stepped aside without a word and let all four men leave the house. The heavy front door closed behind them, sealing Brendan inside with the full weight of everything he had set in motion. With the loan sharks gone from the premises, the lead police officer moved purposefully into the dining room. He unclipped the steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp, metallic clink seemed to cut through Brendan's paralysis. He began retreating frantically, his expensive shoes scrabbling against the Persian rug until his back met the grand dining room window. "No, you cannot do this," Brendan pleaded, holding his shaking hands out before him as though he could physically hold back what was coming. "I am a legitimate technology entrepreneur. This is a terrible family misunderstanding. My father-in-law is confused. He does not understand complex financial vehicles. You cannot arrest me inside my own home." The officer did not slow his advance by a single step. He seized Brendan by the shoulder, spun him around, and drove his chest against the cold glass of the window. Brendan let out a sharp, pathetic gasp as the heavy steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists, pinning his hands behind his back. "Brendan Hearst, you are under arrest for felony wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe elder abuse." The officer's voice was flat and unsparing, filling every corner of the room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Brendan twisted weakly in the officer's grip, his perfectly styled hair now a damp, tangled wreck plastered to his forehead. He wrenched his neck around his wild eyes, tearing across the room until they landed on his wife. "Lydia, please, you have to do something." Brendan's voice cracked into a high, hysterical pitch. "Tell them it was a joint decision. Tell them we were protecting the estate." Call our lawyers. Call someone. You cannot just stand there and let them take me. We were supposed to go to Hawaii. We had a plan all worked out. Lydia did not move. She stood rooted to the floor, completely overwhelmed by the catastrophic scale of what had just collapsed around them. Her face stayed buried in her hands, her shoulders jerking with silent, ragged sobs. She did not look up. She did not offer a single word of comfort or defense to the man she had conspired with, to have her own father committed to a locked psychiatric ward. The full cowardice of their partnership was laid bare for everyone in the room to see. Brendan then swung his desperate gaze toward the far end of the table. His parents were still there, pressed close together, reeling from the brutal implosion of their golden son's carefully constructed image. His mother wept openly, a crumpled linen napkin clutched to her chest, while his father kept his eyes on the floor, his face slack with a deep, undeniable shame. They had arrived at this house expecting to celebrate their son's triumph, and instead, they were watching him led away like a common thief. "Mom, Dad, please help me." Brendan's voice broke entirely, real tears cutting down his face. "Don't let them do this to me." His father slowly raised his head. He looked at his son for a long moment with an expression carrying the full weight of paternal disappointment. He did not step forward. He did not address the officers. He simply drew his arm around his weeping wife, turned them both toward the kitchen, and walked away, putting his back entirely on what his son had become. The finality of that rejection settled over the room like cold air. The lead officer pulled Brendan away from the window and steered him toward the front door. Brendan kept talking the whole way, begging, threatening, crying, his voice ricocheting off the walls of the long hallway in a pathetic, echoing stream. Conrad Faber stood quietly beside the mahogany table, taking in the spectacle with a cool, satisfied expression. I crossed to the front window and drew the heavy velvet curtain aside, just far enough to watch the final scene of this wretched production play out. The red and blue lights of the squad cars throbbed against the fresh white snow, throwing long, strange shadows across the winter lawn. I watched the officers fold Brendan into the back seat of the cruiser. He looked incredibly small, a broken, deflated man with none of his armor left. The door closed hard, sealing him inside. The engines turned over, and the cars rolled away from the curb, their lights shrinking steadily until the dark and the cold swallowed them completely. The house settled into a deep, suffocating silence. The immediate threat was gone, but the sharpest wound in the room had not left with the police. I turned from the window and looked down. Lydia had crossed the floor on her knees, a ruin of expensive cashmere and smeared makeup. She threw herself forward and wrapped both arms tightly around my legs, pressing her tear-streaked face against my knees. The sound that came out of her was loud and ragged and desperate, filling the empty dining room. "Daddy, I'm so sorry." Lydia sobbed, her tears working through the fabric of my trousers. "He manipulated me so completely. Brendan manipulated my mind. He convinced me your memory was genuinely failing. He told me we were protecting the family's assets from being lost. I truly never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to send you to that awful place. He pushed me into agreeing with everything. Please, you have to believe me. Please, Daddy, forgive me." Lydia stayed crumpled on the Persian rug, her fingers clutching the fabric of my trousers, her tears seeping through the fine wool and leaving cold, damp patches against my skin. The force of her weeping rang up into the vaulted ceiling, bouncing off the abandoned crystal glasses and the wine still bleeding across the white tablecloth. I looked down at the crown of her head, at the trembling shoulders of the woman I had raised. Shielded and loved without condition for more than 3 decades. I waited for the familiar pull of paternal instinct, the reflex to kneel down, gather her in, and tell her it would be all right. There was nothing. The well had run dry, burned out by the sheer magnitude of what she had done. I looked at my only daughter and found no warmth left in my eyes, not a trace of pity. Only a hollow, absolute clarity. I reached down with deliberate, unhurried hands and peeled her fingers away from my legs, one by one. I stepped back, breaking the contact between us. She sank heavily onto the hardwood, staring up at me with mascara streaking her face and pure terror twisting her features. She was still waiting for her father to step in and absorb the consequences on her behalf. Brendan manipulated your mind. I repeated her words back to her, my voice completely flat, emptied of every warm inflection. You were an innocent victim caught in his psychological web. You never wanted to hurt me. You were forced to go along with his plans. I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers found the crisp, sharply folded piece of paper I had carried there for 3 days. I drew it out and opened it carefully beneath the hard, unforgiving light of the chandelier. Brendan was the primary architect of the financial fraud. I said, my tone measured and exact. Brendan forged the medical diagnostics. Brendan brought the violent loan sharks into this house. But Brendan did not do this. I released the small, yellowed slip of paper and let it fall, drifting down until it came to rest directly in front of her trembling knees. It was a standard computerized receipt from a seedy, unregulated pawn shop in the grimy industrial district downtown. Lydia looked down at it, and her hysterical sobbing died in her throat as if a switch had been thrown. What remained of the color in her face departed entirely for the second time that night. She knew exactly what the receipt represented. Your mother's diamond necklace. I let the words land in the silence of the room, each one hitting like something solid and heavy. The flawless diamond necklace I gave Gloria on our 20th wedding anniversary. The one she asked me explicitly to see that you inherited and cherished. You did not simply stand aside while Brendan drained my accounts and plotted my institutionalization. You walked into my master bedroom. You pried open the hidden compartment in Gloria's antique vanity, and you took her memory from this house. You pawned her diamonds to buy your reckless husband a few more weeks of breathing room with his dangerous creditors. Brendan did not manipulate you into defiling your own mother's legacy. You made that choice with your own 2 hands. Lydia opened her mouth, the beginning of another fabricated plea, another hollow apology, but the physical evidence crushed it before it could take shape. She stared down at the receipt, her body overtaken by a new and deeper trembling. This was not grief. This was the paralyzing terror of being fully and irrefutably exposed. Love is not a blank check, Lydia. My voice carried a cold, unyielding authority. You believed my love for you was an infinite resource, something you could draw on without limit and without consequence. You assumed that because I am your father, I would eventually absorb your cruelty, your deception, and the full horror of your betrayal. You thought you could discard me and still inherit everything. But true love, the kind that raises a family and holds a home together, needs a bedrock of genuine respect beneath it. Without that, love becomes nothing more than an open wound that parasites are happy to feed on indefinitely. You surrendered every last trace of respect you had for me the instant you willingly put your name on those fraudulent commitment papers. You decided I was expendable. You decided my life, my freedom, and my dignity were worth less than a Hawaiian vacation and the protection of your hollow, extravagant charade. I am not the bewildered, broken, shuffling old man you worked so hard to lock inside a chemical prison. I am the engineer who built this estate with his own hands from nothing. And I am the man who is now taking it back. I drew back the cuff of my bespoke jacket and glanced at the heavy gold watch on my left wrist. It was exactly 9:00 in the evening. You have exactly 60 minutes. I delivered the final, irrevocable terms of her eviction. 1 hour to go upstairs, gather whatever personal belongings fit in the trunk of your car, and walk out through my front door. You will leave the house keys on the kitchen counter. You will not remove any furniture. You will not take any artwork. You take your clothing and you go. If you are still inside these walls at 10, I will have the police back here, and I will personally press felony charges for the deliberate theft of the diamond necklace. The choice is yours. Lydia scrambled to her feet, reading the absolute certainty in my face. She turned and ran up the grand staircase, her footsteps crashing through the quiet house in ragged, frantic bursts. I stood without moving in the bright foyer, listening to the muffled sounds of drawers being wrenched open and suitcases being snapped shut upstairs. 50 minutes later, she came back down hauling 2 large canvas bags, her face lost entirely in the shadow of her hair. She did not glance back at me as she pulled open the front door and stepped out into the freezing snow. I stood on the porch and watched the red taillights of her car recede down the long driveway and dissolve into the dark winter night. I drew my encrypted burner phone from my coat pocket and dialed a local number. I told the professional locksmith who had been sitting in his van 2 blocks away that he was clear to come to the property. Every lock in the house needed replacing. The locksmith pulled up within 20 minutes. I stood in the grand foyer and watched him work his way methodically through the house, the heavy brass cylinders in the front double doors, the side entrances, the rear patio gates. Each one turned out and replaced in sequence. The physical act of changing those locks carried a weight far beyond its mechanics. With every click of a tool and every turn of a screw, I was sealing the breaches that had been cut into the structure of my life. I paid the man in cash, thanked him for his promptness on Christmas Eve, and turned the new deadbolt with a deep, satisfying thud. I listened to his van pull away, the engine note thinning until the only sound that remained was the wind moving through the eaves. For the first time in 8 grinding months, I was completely alone inside my own home. I moved through the quiet, empty rooms at a slow pace. The manufactured tension that had pressed down on this house for so long was simply gone. The hollow cheerfulness, the whispered plotting, the permanent low-grade threat of imminent institutionalization, all of it had been scoured away. I walked past the mahogany dining table where the spilled red wine had dried to a dark, tacky stain on the white linen. Broken crystal from Brendan's mother still scattered the rug, a glittering record of their total undoing. I walked past the concealed cameras I had installed with such care in the ceiling corners. They had done their work with precision, and now they could come down. The parasites had been cut from the host for good. The wound my daughter had opened in me still ached. It sat deep and dull somewhere in my chest, and I suspected it would remain there for whatever years I had left. A father does not want to arrive at the conclusion that his own child is capable of that particular kind of cruelty. We want to believe that the small hands we once held will never be the ones to push us over the edge. But standing in the center of my living room, taking in the untouched holiday decorations and the low, warm glow of the embers in the stone fireplace, the sense of freedom that rose in me was larger than the pain, larger by a considerable margin. I had secured my final years. I had defended the sanctuary I constructed with my own 2 hands. I crossed to the antique crystal decanter sitting on the polished oak side table and poured a generous measure of aged bourbon, feeling the solid, familiar weight of the glass settle into my grip. The warmth of it moved through me slowly as I took a long, deliberate sip, letting the victory fully register. There was no need to feign stiff joints tonight. No need to manufacture a trembling hand or a vacant stare. My mind was clear, sharp, and wholly at rest in its triumph. I carried the glass to the plush leather armchair set directly before the fireplace and lowered myself into it, letting the heat work into my bones. Above the fire hung a large oil portrait of Gloria. Her warm, perceptive eyes looked down through the shifting light of the flames. I lifted my glass toward her painted face in a quiet, private toast. I had kept the promise I made. I had not allowed two greedy, arrogant opportunists to pick apart the legacy the two of us spent 4 decades building. I had defended this home without compromise, and more than anything else, I had kept my dignity intact. Outside the wide bay windows, snow continued to fall, settling across the estate in a deep, clean layer of white covering over everything that had rotted here, leaving the ground silent and unmarked. The storm had finally passed, and so that is where Wallace Crane's story lands, not in a hospital ward, not stripped of his home, but standing alone in his own living room with a glass in his hand and the fire still burning. Right where he belonged. This road cost him something that cannot be repaid. He lost the version of his daughter he thought he knew. He lost the easy comfort of believing that family means safety. But what he gained in exchange was something rarer, the absolute certainty that he had not gone quietly. I believe God has a way of giving a man exactly the time he needs to act, not a day sooner. And Wallace used every one of those days wisely. Here is what I take from his story. If something in your finances feels wrong, investigate it yourself. Don't wait for someone else to tell you what your own name is signed to. Protect your most valuable assets before a crisis arrives. An irrevocable trust, a trusted attorney, a plan. These are not signs of distrust. They are signs of wisdom. Love requires respect to survive. When the respect is gone and the betrayal is documented, walking away is not cruelty. It is self-preservation. And never let anyone convince you that your age makes you a burden. Experience is not a liability. It is the sharpest tool in the room. These are the kinds of father stories that don't get told enough. The ones about men who refused to be discarded, who fought back with patience and precision, and won. If this story stirred something in you, if you know someone who needs a little reminder that family justice is still possible, please pass it along. Share it with them directly. And if you haven't already subscribed to alphadadstories so you don't miss what's coming next, leave me a comment and tell me what you thought. I read them, and they mean more than you know. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.